So it's Good Friday, and there was no hesitation in my mind in thinking of what the theme for today would be, namely love. Actually, it follows on quite well from what I was thinking about yesterday in terms of justice, because one of the key things about justice is often retribution. Somebody needs to pay the price, and I suggested that mercy was actually the key to understanding the biblical notion of what justice looks like. I looked at some examples from the teaching of Jesus, as well as some reflections on the final week of his life. The notion of mercy goes back, in this context at least, to the Passover, because remember that Passover was the time when all these events were happening, the Jewish festival of Passover, a festival which remembered and celebrated, and still does today, of course, in the 21st century, the escape of Hebrew slaves from Egypt into a new life of freedom and liberty. And of course, the stories of the first Easter were taking place at the Passover season. So it's not surprising that as the first Christians looked around for stories and models that might help them to explain what was going on in Holy Week, and specifically today with the cross of Jesus and the death of Jesus, given that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, how and why could he possibly, what would be the point in him dying a criminal's death on a cross? How can you reconcile those things that seem to be at least incompatible, if not actual opposites? Well, as they did so, they found the answer, or part of the answer at least, in the story of the Passover, where as they prepared for that liberating event, the Hebrew slaves sacrificed a lamb, celebrated a meal, and in some way that's never explained or never articulated, certainly never analysed in a kind of rational way, the death of that lamb opened the door to their liberation. And so the earliest Christians, as they were looking for models, I guess, illustrations, if you like, that would help to explain what was going on, what they had experienced in their lives, because they had experienced liberation as a result, ultimately, of course, not just of the death of Jesus, but of what comes afterwards on Easter Day. They took that imagery and in effect said something like, well, remember back then in that original Passover, and remember that the events of Holy Week were taking place at the time of the Passover. Remember back then how, in some way that nobody really understands, the sacrificial death of that lamb brought or was part of the process of bringing freedom and liberation to the people back then. Well, the death of Jesus on the cross has done the same, or something very similar, maybe something even bigger than that for us. It's brought freedom and new life to us as 21st century disciples. Well, of course, it's a metaphor. They were looking around for ways of comprehending what seemed to be incomprehensible, and this was just one of them. And like every metaphor, it's possible to dissect and analyze these narratives so that every detail has to mean something. As a matter of fact, trying to compare and contrast what Jesus accomplished on the cross for us and for all subsequent generations of disciples, what Jesus accomplished on the cross, comparing and contrasting that with the Passover and how the two integrate or connect somehow or another, well, millions upon millions of words have been written trying to get to the bottom of what it means. I've written some of them myself, so I'm not complaining. But sometimes it's possible to analyse a metaphor and actually destroy it in the process. At the heart of the cross, as also of the Passover story, is the unfailing and undeserved love of God extended in mercy to those who are prepared to accept it. And as St. Paul wrote, it's not that we loved God, but that God loved us and continues to do so. And so part of the Easter message is that we're invited to accept that love, not as cheap grace, because actually the love requires us or invites us to follow in the example of Jesus. It invites us to turn around, to repent, if you like, to use that word that is perhaps less fashionable today than it might once have been, to be prepared to change in order to make a lifetime commitment to living out the way of Jesus by following his example in everyday life as well as spiritual devotion. We could spend an absolute lifetime trying to understand in some rational, coherent, intellectual kind of way what was going on in the cross and how it relates to the eternal purposes of God. We may not understand the workings. I suspect that none of us ever shall understand the answers to those questions because they may not even be the right questions. But the key thing on this Good Friday is for us to be reminded and to remind ourselves that generations of Christians before us have discovered that whatever the questions we might have about the mechanics of Jesus' death on the cross and what we mean by saying that Jesus died for us, the simple reality is that when we trust him, when we're prepared to change our lives and to be changed by his living presence with us, when we're prepared for that, it actually works. We find a sense of forgiveness. We find ourselves accepted by God. We find ourselves given a new sense of direction and purpose in life. Sometimes pragmatism outweighs theories, and I suspect this is one of those cases where we just need to trust the unmerited mercy of God, the grace of God, the love of God, which actually is what we reflect on today, which goes way beyond our best imaginations, whether they be the imaginations of how our lives might be or the theories behind whatever was going on in the mind of God in the events of the first Good Friday.